What if you had the power to completely change the landscape of college football and reshape the conferences in the way you wanted? Well, that's exactly what we're going to explore in today's video, tackling a very hot button off-season topic, which is how would you realign the college football conferences? It feels like we've lost the plot with a lot of the recent moves that have happened. We've got insane stuff like Cal and Stanford in the ACC, the Pac-12 down to just 2 teams. There's insanity across the board. So in today's video, I'm going to do exactly what I would do if I was made the commissioner of college football tomorrow and asked to redo the conferences. Before we get into anything else, let's start with my basic realignment philosophy, which is just going to boil down to a few key things that I think most college football fans can agree on. The first is conferences should make geographic sense. It's one of the things that drives people the most bonkers with modern realignment. Northern Illinois should not be in the Mountain West. It should be teams that are close to each other regionally. These regional rivalries matter, and rivalries will be of the utmost importance when I'm considering this. I will always pair a team with at least one rival and as many rivals as it makes sense to do. Tradition also matters. The way these conferences were founded, the things they've gone through, the tradition matters, and upholding those traditions matters when creating this. The more power conferences, in my opinion, the better. I don't think it's possible to have all conferences be completely equal and still keep a lot of the things that make college football so great intact and make these traditions and rivalries so great intact, but it's possible to stretch it out to a certain extent, and I think there was an era in college football where they really had it right. I think there's too many FBS teams. We're going to trim off a little bit of the fluff there in terms of just some teams that I think are too packed or weren't ready to be moved up yet. And then I also want to emphasize coast to coast high-level football because it's something that I feel like we've really lost with the dissolution of the Pac-12 and stuff like that happening. So those are going to be my emphasis and my philosophies as we head into this. So let's start with some programs that I would just demote to the FCS just so I don't have to worry about placing them. It's going to start with Kennesaw State, Sam Houston, Delaware, and Missouri State. Based on the recent moves that have happened, the NCAA has changed their standards. They don't have the stadium requirement anymore. It's just a matter of whether or not you can fork over a certain amount of money. And I just think those 4 programs weren't necessarily ready to move up. And I know Sam Houston just won 10 games, so it's like, how can you say that? But if you've seen their stadium and their facilities, you know the truth, which is they weren't ready. They weren't qualified to move up. And then we have Charlotte and UMass, where it's just cleaner to remove those teams, and they have not been remotely competitive since they were promoted. So I think it's just safe to eliminate those teams and move them back to the FCS level. So in my model, we would still have a Power 5. Currently, we have a Power 4 in real life, but I would go back to 5 with the ACC, the Pac-12, the Big Ten, the SEC, and the Big 12. And then, of course, we've got the independents as well. But I did say I want to have as many power conferences as possible. And these ones might not be considered power conferences, but I would also add 2 mid-majors in college football, the WAC and the Big East. I really think having these 2 conferences that any year can compete with the Power 5, and any year can be just as good as one of the Power 5, but might not have some of the mainstay big-name programs. That's really important to me, and I feel like having those conferences is fun. It's fun in college basketball. It's fun in college football whenever we see one of these lower-tier conferences have a really good season and have multiple ranked teams, and that's exactly what those conferences represent in my mind. And then we're going to fill it out with a group of 4, the American, the MAC, the Mountain West, and the Sun Belt. They might be a tier lower, but are still going to be competitive conferences. And there's a lot of tradition to uphold with those conferences, and that's exactly what I'm doing by including them. So let's start by revealing who my independent teams would be. It would be Notre Dame, Army, and Navy, a very simple group of independents. If you want UMass to stay here, they would probably be an independent, so you could just loop them in there. But Notre Dame, in my mind, should always be independent. It's one of the great traditions of college football, having them be independent. In my humble opinion, I also would put Penn State in here, but I know that's kind of controversial because of how long they've been in the Big Ten now, but they were independent for a long time, and so was Florida State, to be completely honest. But we're just going to keep things a little more tame, especially at the start here. And then Army and Navy, it just feels right having Army and Navy be independent. It's what I grew up with. It makes a lot of sense in my brain, and it also doesn't lead to any issues with that Army-Navy game at the end of the year, which we've started to see with them both being in the American Conference now. So we'll start with some of the simpler conferences here, which is the Pac-10, which has that ugly Pac-12 logo there, but this case, it would still be the Pac-10. 10 schools, and it's just the Pac-10 as it should be. It's going to be the 4 California schools, 2 from the Bay Area, 2 from LA, the 2 Washington schools, the 2 Oregon schools, the 2 Arizona schools. Very simple, as it should be. We're going to bring back and make West Coast football great again. I was raised in the West Coast. I grew up in Oregon, and so you're going to see a little bit of that influence in here, no doubt. And one of the things is bring back the Pac-10. I want the Pac-10 to be back to its former glory. The next conference is going to be the Big Ten, and the Big Ten follows suit of every other conference here outside of the Pac-10, which is going to be that they have 12 teams and 12 members. In the Big Ten, it doesn't exactly irk me if it's not at exactly 10 members. I've never been a guy that just is super bothered by that, and I think the Big Ten represents itself as more of a brand. Like the 10 doesn't necessarily matter as much. And for that reason, the Pac-12 could keep its name if it wants, but to me, I just like the Pac-10 better aesthetically as a name. That might be weird. To me, it never made sense to have Penn State in the Big Ten. I'm aware that it makes sense now, and it seems right now because they've been there for a while, but geographically wise, I feel like I have them in a much better spot. So don't judge me till where you see where they are. But having Michigan, Ohio State, all of those founding Big Ten members here makes a lot of sense. And then Nebraska, to me, also makes sense. It never bothered me too much to see them here. I know they have a lot of rivals like Missouri and Colorado and, where they used to be in sort of the Midwest, but I feel like the Big Ten still makes a ton of sense for them. And then Iowa State being in the same conference as Iowa. Recently, it didn't really make sense for that to be the case because Iowa State was so poverty of a program, but they've really rounded a corner and they're investing. So I feel like a Big Ten invite in this case makes sense to round out that conference at 12. The next conference here is going to be the SEC. The SEC definitely had a little bit trimmed off of it, and it's to get rid of some of those recent realignment moves that I don't like. Like we got rid of Texas A&M and Missouri and Texas and Oklahoma and all those schools that bothered me here. We're going to have Tulane return home to the SEC in what is a move that I think should happen because I think Tulane's ready as a program. They're probably not going to enter as a great SEC team, but when we're talking about balancing things out, the SEC is going to have to sacrifice a little bit just for the good of college football. And I don't think this conference is too difficult to figure out because you're still going to have Bama and Auburn and South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, LSU, the Mississippi schools, Tennessee, Vanderbilt, all these founding schools. There's still lots of great rivalries in here. And so the SEC, I feel like, is pretty simple to figure out. I know some people might be bothered by some of the teams excluded here, but the SEC has always had the rivalry games at the end of the season, and they could still find a way to make those make sense in the non-conference. This next conference will be the Big 12, and it'll make a little bit of that SEC movement make a little bit more sense because the Big 12, I think, is in a really good spot with this realignment. We're going to have Texas in here and Oklahoma. Very important that we have those two rivals here, but I also want to have Texas A&M and Oklahoma State, those two rivals of Oklahoma and Texas that are arguably just as big, and then Texas Tech, Baylor, Houston, a couple more Texas schools in here. And then this is where it makes sense to have Missouri and Arkansas and the Kansas schools. Colorado, a little bit more suspect with their placement here, but it still does make sense with their old Big 8 allegiances and where they used to be. And so I feel like Colorado, I can still feel good about having them here. Feels a little bit like the Southwest Conference, a little bit like the Big 8, a little bit like the Big 12, and that's kind of how I like it. We've got a healthy mix of Texas, Oklahoma schools, rivalries being protected, and games that I'm just going to look forward to seeing happen. This next conference is the ACC, and it is the power conference I feel the least good about, just because I did massacre the ACC a little bit in this realignment. I still think this is a fine conference, and it has a lot of the founding members of the ACC. Florida State and Clemson are still in here. They'll still play Florida and South Carolina at the end of the year. I thought about something crazy like a Florida State for South Carolina swap, but I think that would just piss a lot of people off. You've got Virginia and Virginia Tech in here. You've got all the North Carolina schools in Wake Forest, North Carolina, Duke, NC State. And then James Madison is a school that I've seen rise a lot, and I just think in the state of Virginia, it makes a lot of sense. There's maybe a couple schools you could swap out for that. If you're looking from strictly a football perspective, maybe you're like, hey, Liberty, but I know there's like academic stuff there. I don't know if that is completely baffling, but for some reason, James Madison in this conference just scratches the right itch in my brain. And then Maryland and Boston College, kind of an awkward fit based on who's left in this conference. Like, there's not really a ton of Northeast schools there, but it's just where the dominoes sort of fell for this realignment. There could be room for them in the Big East potentially, but you'll have to let me know how you would change that around. I'm aware the ACC takes a hit. I'm aware it looks a little awkward with how it is positioned, but I did the best with what I had here. And some of you might not even consider this to be a Power 5 conference with these ones we have. Now we're going to get to my favorite conference that I rebuilt, and that is the WAC conference. The WAC conference underwent a ton of different iterations, and I really think we were cooking with this conference. Earlier I mentioned that I want to bring back West Coast college football. I want to make it great again. And we look at the WAC. These are all teams, most of them at one point or another were members of the WAC conference as it rose, and it's just another high-level West Coast football conference, having both BYU and Utah here that we've seen competitive at the national level. Same with TCU and Boise State, a program like SMU that's in here, and then some other programs that either have potential or we've already seen the potential like UNLV and UTSA, UTEP, Texas State, Louisiana Tech in here as an honorary member. They were in the WAC at one point. Most of these schools, if not all of them, were in the WAC at one point or another, and aesthetically I love the WAC. I love what the WAC represents, and this is one of those fun mid-major conferences where maybe they can't compete with those Power 5 every year, but there might be a year where we've got 4 or 5 teams that are ranked in this conference and they are truly competitive and they've got some national competitors. To me, that is a lot of the essence of college football that I really love, just from my childhood, but also just when it happens in the modern day. Which takes us to my second favorite conference that I conjured up, which is the Big East. It's going to look a little bit different than the traditional Big East, but still heavy on nostalgia here. We're going to have a lot of those founding members that we all knew and loved, like Pitt, West Virginia, Rutgers, Syracuse, South Florida, Cincinnati, UConn, Louisville. It's beautiful. And then I went on and tacked on a few more that just makes sense to get this to 12. We brought in Central Florida, which is a much better program now, a power level program that could have that rivalry versus South Florida. Miami, who was in the Big East for a long time there as well, has a ton of history tied into this conference. I love having them there as well. Penn State, to me, this is where Penn State makes way too much sense. You've got Virginia, you've got Pitt in there. I know Penn State might see this as below them, but I feel like if that program truly wants to make East Coast football great again, more specifically the Northeast Coast, this is it. And then Marshall, the rivalries there make sense as well with West Virginia, and I feel like others would develop. This makes my heart so warm to look at a conference like this because I feel like it truly embraces football in the Northeast. And yes, it does butcher the ACC a little bit, and the ACC is almost unrecognizable as a result of this. And you could argue that Boston College and Virginia Tech deserve a spot in here because they are former Big East teams, but I just wanted to have it more uniform at 12, so a few things were swapped around, and ultimately I just made the Big East make a little bit more sense than the ACC. Let's get to our group of 4 conferences where I admit things are a little bit more sloppy, especially with the American Conference. You'll have to let me know down in the comments what are some fixes you could sort of see, but I wanted to give a spot for some of the rejects in the group of 5 level and make it make some geographical sense as best as I could. I admit that Memphis probably gets the shortest end of the stick here because they're stuck in a conference when right now we're talking about them getting promoted to a higher conference, but they are at the group of 5 level right now. We've got some Texas schools in here like Rice and North Texas. We've got a South Carolina school, a Coast Carolina, we got a North Carolina school, a couple of them in App State, East Carolina, Liberty's in here. And so just enough to make a little bit of sense in that kind of pocket from Texas up to like Tennessee to North Carolina, South Carolina, Kentucky. It makes a little bit more sense. It's going to be high-level group of 5 football and maybe a conference that in a given year could be having a better year than the Big East or the WAC, and that's something I like. The MAC conference is the next conference here, though, and it's something I'm very proud of because I didn't change a single thing. Same 12 members that they have right now, it's perfect. Don't touch it. NIU's not going anywhere in this scenario. If you wanted to make one change here, you could convince me to move Buffalo to maybe like if you were having some fun tinkering around with like the Big East because Buffalo's not like a traditional member. And if you were a huge UMass advocate, you could argue UMass in here, and I wouldn't argue either because they were in the MAC for a little bit of time. But there's the MAC. Then we have the Mountain West, which represents step 3 of my 3-step masterful plan to bring back West Coast football. And it's going to give the remaining West Coast teams a home. You've got Fresno State, San Diego State, Colorado State, all high-level programs out in that West Coast. And then some programs that we've known can have great seasons, like both of the New Mexico schools, Hawaii, Utah State, San Jose State. They're not proud programs, but they're programs that deserve a shot at the FBS level in a group of 4 conference like I did here. And then just just to fill it out to get to a clean 12 teams, I decided to promote a few, I think, FBS-ready programs on the West Coast. Because to me, that's one of the things that the West Coast is lacking right now, is programs that are relevant, that are playing the highest level of football they can be playing. Sacramento State's ready. They're investing heavily right now. We're moving them up. Idaho's a program that demoted themselves. I'm making an executive order and saying, sorry, Idaho, you're back. Get here. And then UC Davis. They're already in the Mountain West in a non-football capacity. Let's just bring up their football team too and say, hey, you know what? You guys are ready. Let's make it happen. So it's the Mountain West. Like I said, this is my three-step plan to make the West Coast football great again. It might irk some of you. Some of you might say, well, I'm never going to elect you commissioner because of what you've seen here today with my West Coast bias, if you want to call it. But I really think it's important for coast-to-coast greatness in football, for things to make sense and feel right. And then finally, the last conference here is going to be the Sun Belt Conference. And the essence of the Sun Belt is still there. A lot of its original members still here. It's really just all schools in Florida, Georgia, Bama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. So it feels right. It's a great Southern Conference to get in here, kind of like the lower tier Southern Conference, just like the role that we have the Mountain West serving, the role we have the MAC serving, and kind of the role we have the American serving. And it's going to be the essence of the Sun Belt, like I said, and also just some programs that make sense to have in the same conference, like FAU and FIU, things that some people can't figure out in real life. And then Jacksonville State actually seems like a really nice fit here. So I was happy I was able to get that done and get, a nice pocket of Alabama schools to compete at the Group of 4 level. So there you have it. In all its glory, there is my dream college football conference realignment. This video is going to upset probably most of you, and that's because this is whatever my sick and twisted brain has conjured up from my memories of college football. There's no doubt fans of programs that are absolutely furious with where I place them, and so just let me know down in the comments, what do you think I got wrong? What do you think you would change? What would you do if you were college football commissioner? It's kind of a fun thing to toy around with in your brain because the possibilities are really limitless. Like, for example, I did 11 conferences here. You might say, actually, I would only do 10 conferences. Or I would do 15 conferences. I would promote even more teams, or I would relegate even more teams, or have a promotion relegation system in place. In mine, I would just realign the conferences like this, and I think the rest would work itself out. But let me know down in the comments what you would do with all this stuff, and if I annoyed you or I irked you and you don't trust my football opinion anymore as a result of this video, I understand. Like I said, I've got a little bit of a West Coast bias, I think, and all of that stuff. But it's just how I was raised. I can't help it. It's a part of who I am. But I had a ton of fun making this video for what it's worth, and I hope you guys enjoyed watching it as well. If you're not subscribed, check that you're subscribed because you might not be, and you might think you are, if that makes sense. That's all I got for you guys today, and yeah, that's all I got. I'll talk to you guys later this week.